Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal exciting events in the next 2 weeks from September 15th to 26th, 2025. First, the week opens with Nina Reeves determined to repair a fracture she did not cause but refuses to accept as permanent. She approaches the rift between Britt Westbourne and Liesl Albrecht as both a friend and a woman who understands the corrosive power of grief. Britt's staged death may have been born from desperation and danger, but it left Liesl stranded in an unresolved mourning cycle, furious at being denied closure while the rest of Port Charles moved on. Nina recognizes that apologies cannot rewrite the months of absence, the empty rituals, and the private anger that followed every reminder of Britt's supposed fate. Her strategy is steady and pragmatic: create safe spaces where mother and daughter can be in the same room without detonating, invite mutual friends who can temper the temperature, and remind both women that a second chance is rare in a town that often denies them. Yet every step forward is shadowed by Liesl's conviction that love without truth is manipulation, and by Britt's fear that her return has become another wound for a mother who once promised steel but also needed tenderness. As Nina tests boundaries, the hospital corridors amplify the tension. Britt's colleagues treat her like a ghost who walked back into her old life and expects the machines to power on, while Liesl's colleagues treat her rage as if it were a professional hazard to be contained. Nina navigates competing narratives: that Liesl's anger is justified, that Britt's decisions saved her life, that both truths can coexist without canceling each other. She seeks incremental progress rather than grand reconciliations, suggesting acts of accountability that are visible and concrete. Britt agrees to own the fallout that her deception created, not as a public spectacle but as a series of deliberate gestures toward repair. Liesl allows herself to hear what she has already decided she does not want to hear, which is that surviving in Port Charles often requires choices that look unforgivable in daylight. The question becomes whether the two women can tolerate the discomfort long enough for trust to take root again, or whether the old patterns, silence, pride, retaliation, will reclaim them. While Nina holds one family together by sheer will, Anna Devane pushes forward with an investigation that threatens to unmake another. New evidence lands on her desk, and its neat alignment with earlier threads triggers a familiar suspicion: when evidence arrives too ready, someone has done the arranging. Brick's covert plant designed to make Drew Kane look guilty of bribing Judge Eva Heron appears to be working in the worst possible way, by generating exactly the kind of corroboration that prosecutors adore and investigators distrust. Anna dissects chain of custody gaps, consults timelines that refuse to be clean, and weighs whether exposing the plant would collapse a case that may still contain genuine corruption. She knows Drew's reputation will absorb the stain long before any court date, and she understands that a judge's name entangled with bribery can topple public confidence far beyond one docket. Her instincts tell her that a frame within a frame is unfolding, and that Port Charles is once again mistaking a tidy narrative for the truth. Second, Emma Scorpio Drake and Giovanni Gio Palmieri begin the week with a knot of unease that tightens with every alert crossing their screens. What first appears as routine chatter about research logistics quickly accumulates into a pattern that refuses to be dismissed: mismatched timestamps on customs declarations, a container number that recurs on 2 different manifests, and a courier log that records a handoff at a location that had been closed for renovations for months. Emma approaches the puzzle with the clinical discipline she inherited from her parents, mapping each inconsistency against prior anomalies she catalogued during earlier hospital irregularities. Gio, more attuned to the cadence of street signals and how people hide their intentions, reads the negative space between facts and senses pressure from actors who prefer shadows to signatures. Together they isolate the common thread: a sensitive shipment marked for Professor Hank Dalton, accompanied by a trail of minor accidents that feel less like coincidence and more like a controlled burn designed to destroy traces while keeping the core delivery intact. The deeper they dig, the more the shipment takes on the weight of a catalyst. On paper, it is described as laboratory reagents bound for a clinical collaboration, but mass values, insurance riders, and unusually high handling fees hint at contents that cannot tolerate scrutiny. The route adds another layer of concern: a last-minute transload, a truck diversion after a reported tire blowout, and an overnight delay explained by a warehouse power outage that no surrounding business remembers experiencing. Emma overlays the route with a timeline of recent incidents in Port Charles, data irregularities, a lab freezer failure, a missing technician who resigned by email and never collected a final paycheck, and sees the outline of a design. If the crate holds experimental vectors or neural modulators associated with Dalton's most controversial lines of inquiry, the stakes extend beyond academic reputation into patient safety and criminal exposure. Every accident becomes a breadcrumb in reverse, meant to lead investigators away rather than toward the truth. Realizing that official channels could be compromised or too slow, Gio seeks out Sonny Corinthos with a request that is equal parts practical and protective. He asks for harbor eyes that do not appear on any municipal schedule, for quiet verification of which containers actually touch the pier, and for a buffer around Emma while she works through the evidence. The favor is framed not as an escalation but as a safeguard for a civilian who has already crossed paths with dangerous currents. With discreet dockside checks and a short, need-to-know list, information begins to flow, a container seal replaced at sea, a yard move logged under a now-retired supervisor's badge, and footage of a van idling near a service entrance the night the power supposedly failed. Gio channels each finding back to Emma and ultimately becomes her line of defense when the investigation draws unwanted attention. When a tail appears in a hospital parking structure and a stranger lingers too long near Emma's car, Gio positions himself to intercept, extracts her from the blind spot, and preserves a flash drive she had tucked in the console with photos of the original manifest before it was altered. Third, Britt Westbourne's return to public spaces in Port Charles is met not with celebration but with a chill that follows her from corridor to corridor. The city retains a long memory for injuries, and Britt's ledger includes deceptions, sudden exits, and collateral damage that never quite faded. The first hard edge she meets could easily be Emma Scorpio Drake, whose world was once bruised by the chaos orbiting Britt, though it might just as well be any number of residents who believe trust is earned slowly and forfeited quickly. Eyes narrow at the nurse's station, hands pause over charts, and casual conversations fall silent as she approaches. The judgment is not theatrical, it is practical, a collective assessment that says the town has learned to protect itself. In that atmosphere, every step Britt takes feels like a petition for re-entry, and every nod she receives is provisional at best. The resistance gathers shape at General Hospital, where Britt's presence is a mirror held up to old wounds. Staff members recall nights when triage blended with gossip, when corridors carried rumors of loyalties bent for personal gain, and when the boundaries between crisis and spectacle blurred. For Emma, if she is the one to confront Britt first, the reaction is anchored in history rather than impulse. The daughter of physicians has been raised on the ethics of care and the cost of reckless choices, and she understands the difference between survival tactics and manipulations that leave others paying the bill. Even among those who try to separate past from present, the collective skepticism is unmistakable. Britt registers the weight of it and recognizes that any hope of belonging again will begin not with explanations but with accountability. The city is not short on second chances, but access to them depends on whether the returning party can tolerate humility long enough to rebuild trust brick by brick. That recognition drives Britt toward the most difficult threshold, the space occupied by Liesl Albrecht, a mother who loved with ferocity and suffered in ways that language rarely captures. The years since Britt's disappearance did not erase Liesl's devotion, they corroded it, calcifying grief into anger and anger into a guardedness that looks like iron. Britt lowers her guard in response, not as strategy but as necessity, offering the only currency that might move the needle, unvarnished ownership of the harm she caused and a willingness to make amends without a timetable. She frames her defense not as a justification but as context, acknowledging that choices made under duress still leave dents that must be repaired one by one. She proposes small, measurable gestures, consistent presence, transparent communication, and a place for Liesl's pain that is not treated as an obstacle to be managed but as a truth to be respected. The relationship will not snap back into place, it will either be rebuilt with new materials or collapse under the strain of memory. In that uncertain space, hope becomes a discipline rather than a feeling. Away from the hospital's fluorescent light, the Quartermaine estate and its extended circle absorb a blow that reorders priorities in an instant. Jason Morgan becomes the carrier of news no one wants to say aloud, and the announcement of Monica Quartermaine's passing moves through families, friendships, and histories like a slow-rolling tide. Monica's presence anchored generations, her absence creates a vacuum that cannot be filled, only honored. Jason handles logistics with the quiet efficiency he reserves for moments that demand steadiness, while grief settles on him with the heaviness of responsibility rather than the theatrics of public mourning. Tracy Quartermaine steps into parallel motion, harnessing her own blend of resolve and candor to keep practical matters from collapsing under the weight of sentiment. The two connect not because they have always agreed but because loss has a way of clarifying roles, and in this moment their partnership keeps the broader family from splintering. Memorial arrangements begin to take shape, and with them comes a shared understanding that Monica's legacy is measured less by ceremony than by continuity. Fourth, Danny Morgan approaches the coming week with a resolve that feels older than his years, focused on a single priority that cuts through adult feuds and logistics. With Monica Quartermaine's memorial anticipated for the week of September 22nd to 26th, he believes Scout needs to stand with her family and absorb the ritual that will define how they remember their matriarch. His appeal to Drew Kane is anchored in stability rather than sentimentality, centered on the way funerals knit fractured branches together and teach children where they come from. Danny knows that shared grief can be formative rather than scarring when the adults around a child minimize conflict and maximize presence. He frames the moment as a lesson in legacy, continuity, and love expressed through action, sensing that the absence of Scout at such a milestone would echo louder than any of the grown-ups intend. The practical realities around that intention are thorny. Drew must navigate a lattice of court orders, custody norms, and Quartermaine politics that rarely flow in one direction. The memorial itself will be a convergence of history and obligation, with Jason Morgan managing logistics alongside Tracy Quartermaine, who understands that the family's center of gravity has shifted and must be protected. In the quiet spaces between phone calls and arrangements, the question of Scout's attendance becomes a referendum on cooperation after months of strain. Elizabeth Baldwin's earlier decision to tell Drew about Monica's passing before the news became public gives him time to process, while Danny's insistence reframes the debate as a chance to model grace. The family's challenge is not simply to secure a chair for Scout in the front row, it is to create an atmosphere in which a child can mourn without absorbing the static of old grudges. Amid this preparation, the canvas widens with the imminent debut of Erica Slezak, likely portraying a long-lost sister of Monica who steps into Port Charles carrying equal measures of history and disruption. Her arrival promises an avenue into Monica's pre-Port Charles past, the hidden corners of a life that even the Quartermaines never fully mapped. She brings stories, letters, and perhaps the kind of keepsakes that convert hearsay into lineage, inviting both tenderness and tension at a time when everyone is raw. The newcomer's presence at the memorial could turn reminiscence into revelation, sparking recollections that shift how the family interprets Monica's choices and the architecture of the estate she leaves behind. Old photographs, coded notes, and a timeline only she can supply will complicate the narrative, positioning her as both archivist and catalyst. Where there is a catalyst, there is also contest, and Martin Gray is well positioned to guide the newcomer through the legal thicket that always sprouts when a Quartermaine will is at stake. Tracy understands probate as a battleground where sentiment is honored in speeches but settled on paper, and she will not cede ground without a disciplined defense of Monica's intent. Martin, meanwhile, will parse the will's language, hunt for codicils, and evaluate whether any late correspondence or handwritten amendments should be recognized. His counsel is pragmatic: establish standing, verify authenticity, and decide whether negotiation serves the client better than litigation. What begins as a family welcome may quickly branch into hearings about trusts, healthcare proxies, and philanthropic commitments, with ELQ's gravity tugging at every decision. The memorial week thus becomes both a ceremony of farewell and an opening act in a longer arbitration over legacy. Far from the Quartermaine mansion, the hospital contends with a shock of its own as the status of Nathan West veers from a settled tragedy to a living question. The confirmation that he is alive lands like a force of nature, and Liesl Albrecht's body registers the blow before her mind can order it, sending her to the floor in a faint that compresses years of guarded grief into one fragile moment. The medical chart suggests survival by intervention rather than chance, with scars that speak to captivity, controlled treatments, and a system designed to preserve life without restoring identity. Port Charles reacts by filling in blanks with speculation, clandestine clinics, trafficked patients, falsified records. Each possibility erodes trust in institutions that prefer definitive endings, and each answer begged gives rise to two more questions, pressing the police, the hospital, and the media into uncomfortable proximity. Finally, the investigation into Drew Kane tightens like a vice, and every new subpoena or forensic addendum increases the pressure on a web of allies, rivals, and opportunists who misjudged how long paper trails can sleep before they wake. Detectives peel back layers of shell accounts, encrypted messaging apps, and courier services that specialize in discretion, aligning transaction timestamps with surveillance pings and license plate scans that were once dismissed as noise. Prosecutors quietly test theories in chambers, gauging which narrative a judge will actually allow before a jury hears it, and the PCPD narrows its list of persons of interest to those who touched the evidence directly or benefited most from its manipulation. The sense in Squad Room Whispers is clear: an arrest is not a hypothetical endpoint but an imminent opening move, and whoever is taken first will define the tempo of everything that follows. Michael Corinthos sits at the fulcrum of that calculus, assessing exposure in a matrix that includes family history, corporate obligations, and the uneven goodwill he carries with law enforcement. His risk pivots on how aggressively the state frames the conspiracy, whether as isolated obstruction or as a broader, continuing enterprise that folded Drew's case into a larger scheme. If investigators tie Michael to communications that suggest coordination, or if a cooperating witness describes meetings in language that implies intent rather than proximity, jail time shifts from rumor to probability. His lawyers prepare parallel lanes, one for attacking chain of custody defects and the provenance of the most damaging exhibits, and another for negotiating a path that avoids incarceration if the prosecution insists on leverage through spectacle. The cruel reality is that in Port Charles optics often drive outcomes, and a single leaked document can outweigh a month of careful filings. The bleak question of whether Michael can avoid a cell becomes more fraught when analysts consider what happens if he cannot. Should he be remanded or accept a plea that includes confinement, the narrative outside those walls will not freeze, it will mutate, and the vacuum around Drew's case will attract new actors. In a grim, pragmatic sense, any fresh threat to Drew while Michael is behind bars would redirect investigative focus toward rival networks with motive and means, forcing detectives to reconsider earlier assumptions and deprioritize Michael as the axis of the story. No one close to him would ever wish for harm to prove a point, but the uncomfortable logic remains: new violence against Drew would explode the current theory map, erase tidy timelines, and expose antagonists who have been hiding behind the convenience of a single suspect. In a town where timing is weaponized, even misfortune can become a pivot. That potential pivot is why the PCPD keeps widening the aperture on suspects beyond the usual family and corporate gravitational pull. Investigators review procurement orders linked to medical tech, traffic patterns around warehouses that coincided with document alterations, and communications touching judges, consultants, and fixers whose names tend to surface only when scandals crest. They run behavioral comparisons between those who publicly advocate for Drew and those who privately profit from his legal limbo, looking for the telltale stutter in alibis or a mismatch between denials and data. The more they map phone metadata and financial flows, the more it looks like multiple parties had reasons to shape Drew's fate, some to bury him, others to keep him alive but discredited. That multiplicity is both a challenge and an opportunity. A complex conspiracy creates more seams to pry open, but it also gives every participant a chance to push blame sideways. For Michael, contingency planning replaces sleep. He documents benign explanations for meetings that now look ominous in hindsight, arranges interim corporate stewardship to keep business interests insulated from legal tremors, and drafts personal statements that thread the needle between accountability and self-preservation. He also thinks about Scout and the message his choices will send during Monica's memorial period, knowing that family rituals are both refuge and scrutiny in Port Charles.